Just watching that, it reminds me that election night used to be a little bit easier some time ago. I noticed we were using predictions, predicting what the result would be at a certain point. We had to stop doing that because it became harder and harder to be certain that we're seeing more and more contests. The last federal election, I think, was more than 30 seats, which weren't two-party preferred contests. So you're having to spend a lot more time looking at individual seats and trying to determine whether the seat is in doubt or not. So it's the whole process of doing everything has become much harder, more candidates on the ballot paper and the like. There's actually some things which weren't on television, which weren't part of television coverages, which I'm actually particularly proud of, designing the whole way the website works with all the background material on elections. That was all my idea and my design on that. In 2007, we did some little calculators which allowed you to predict what was going to be the Senate result by state. I was very proud of that because that actually exposed how bad the ticket voting system was for the Senate, and it eventually led to its replacement. So there was some just simple bits and pieces like that which were using just perfectly. I mean, I'm a political scientist by background, not a journalist. So those sorts of things really sort of, I rather enjoyed that. Had the frustration this federal election where our computer seized up at a bad time for technical reasons, entirely technical reasons. And if it hadn't been for that, we would have had the clear picture of what was going on much earlier in the evening, because the scale of the result on election night, I'm not sure anyone really picked that up for quite some time. And if we'd had our computer running at 7:30 to 7:45, we would have known what was going on. So that was just one of the more remarkable results I've ever worked on. But it's harder and harder to do it because it's from a lower primary vote. When we started doing this, let's go back to the start. 1989, I'd done originally a maths and science degree in computer science and worked in the computer industry. And I went back to university in the early 80s and did an economics politics degree. And at the end of that was hunting around for a job to do. And the ABC advertised a job for 6 months to work as a researcher on the 1990 federal election to do the background material. They had about 150 applicants for this 6-month job. I took a pay cut leaving the computer industry. I'd actually been looking around to do something else anyway, like economics, trainee economist jobs or something. And I saw this job and I thought, well, I could always go to economics. And I was picked, I think, in large extent. Ian Carroll, I clearly had the knowledge, a good referee, but I had this computer experience, which in 1989 was rather hard to find somebody with that computer experience. So I think he really wanted me to talk to the computer people, because the computer people and the journalists could never talk to each other. And so I became the conduit and the one that was responsible for making sure the computers worked and the computers were right. Well, technically, as the last election, I couldn't be responsible for some filling up of memory in a computer system because I don't really check that. But the whole mechanism that we call the elections was changed. And it became, at the end of that election coverage in 1990, Ian Carroll, who'd chosen me, Geraldine Duke's husband, late husband, sort of came up to me and said, you are my best choice. And then they gave me this job to define how a new computer system would work. And so I came up with the basic design of how the calculations would all work, and the software was written. We used it for the first time in the Queensland election in 1992, I remember, and we called it very early. And I remember I was brought up onto the panel to talk to Andrew Olley. And I said, well, at this stage, the government is back, and with a comfortable majority, probably about the same as they had before the election. And Andrew looked at me and said, "It's a brave man or a fool who calls an election this early." Just one of those great moments in television, in things. And then 1993 was interesting. A lot of people didn't think Keating was going to win, including the board. David Hill was the chairman at the time. Rod Cameron, the Labor Party's pollster, was on the board, and John Bannon, the former South Australian Labor Premier, were on the board. They didn't think Labor was going to win. And then our computer system, we were using a new computer system for the first time, but we hadn't thought through how the graphics would look. What happened in 1993 for the first time is that, as well as the results by polling place coming in and the totals for them, we actually got the history in the same polling places for the first time, which allowed us very early on to pick what the swing was. And that was showing from very early on that Keating was back. But we hadn't thought through our graphics properly and how they looked. We used to draw these bars for first preferences, and then we'd take the other bars off and draw two-party preferred. But in 1993, for the first time, because there's polling place information, we didn't have, the number wasn't a two-party preferred, it was a projected two-party preferred. So sometimes the two-party preferred bars contradicted the primaries. And as I remember one very early on, Isaacs, and this graph came up and had the Liberals on 70%. And I remember Jim Middleton on camera saying, well, let's factor in the preferences. And the graph went like that and had Labor ahead. He said, oh, that's obviously wrong. And so up in Sydney, where they was, getting this perception that we thought Labor was winning and the graphs were playing up, they thought there was something wrong, and there was these mad phone calls back and forwards between Canberra and Sydney. And eventually about 20 to 9, I got on camera and said government re-elected with about a seat majority of 9. I remember Angioli going, well, that's an early prediction. And it was quite right. I think it was 13 in the end, so we're within 2 seats of getting that right very early. Much harder to do now because it's much harder to get those swings consistent. It's much harder to pick those seats when you're not sure what order the candidates are going to finish. So it's got much harder in recent years. We've stopped using predictions because the predictions just... We've got them in the computer. We don't show. We showed a prediction in the New South Wales election, and it over-predicted. The Men's government was there, but not in majority, and so we stopped using it since, unless we're absolutely sure. It's become much more complex. The major party vote is lower. There are more and more independents and Greens who are finishing in the final pairing, and that makes it much more difficult. The Electoral Commission does do preference counts, which when I first did an election in 1990 they didn't. The states all do preference counts. The other thing that's got much harder is some pre-poll voting, that half of the votes are cast before election day. They get counted much later in the evening. We don't get them till late in the evening, and that makes it very hard to be absolutely certain until you see them come in, because they can behave differently from the polling day votes. We've seen differences of 2 to 3 to 4% between polling day and the pre-poll votes in terms of swing, and that factors into your prediction later on. You might have somebody on 52, and then once the pre-polls start arriving, that projection comes back to about 50.8 or something, rather than you can't call it. So that's made it all much harder. So there's lots of things now that we didn't have to do once upon a time. Nowadays, it's a much tougher job. They're wanting to do more and more graphics compared to what they used to be. And and sometimes it's like I compared some of our recent coverages to, like, if you've ever watched an AFL or a rugby league game, they decide beforehand who's the key player they're going to follow, and they'd vote a camera to following them around. And if they've had a really crap game, it becomes a bit dull at half time because this person has been barely on camera all night. But we're getting more and more of that. People are expecting us to do this or that during the evening. A good one was the federal election. I got into an argument with the producers at one time who insisted I do the 6 teal seats. And I'm saying, no, they're all undecided and it doesn't matter. We've got this thumping 30 to 40 seat majority, but you need to be talking about that. No, we're doing the teal seats, and up come the teal seats. None of them are clear. And I think I was having to try and do it on the fly. I think one of them, at least, actually, from my rough comment, I think they'll win, promptly called victory and then lost. So I mean, sometimes people think I'm completely on top of it. Sometimes I haven't had a chance to look at these seats. We had another argument late in the evening, wanted me to come back to some doubtful seats. I said, no, we want to do this seat and this. We need to show the size of the swing. That's what we're doing here. And we got caught up in, sometimes they've overproduced everything and they decided this is the story, and nobody has had the story of that night as being about a landslide. And so trying to get to talk about how that was going on was, in the end, it made worse by the fact our computer was playing up early, and so we didn't know that until late. I mean, I remember we got the computer back and the graphics, and I brought up the chamber on the diagram, and suddenly Labor was on 76 seats. And went, that's the first time I've seen that. Labor's in office, and can I just say, they will win easily, and this may be a very big majority. And I said that, and I think I was the first person to say that on the night. And there was a lot of, I remember, I had an argument with them wanting to do Victorian seats. I said, no, I want to do Tasmania. And people who weren't looking at the figures would come, why do you want to do Tasmania? I said, have you seen these numbers? And up they came, and they were massive swings. And sometimes it was one of those nights where, I don't talk to the producer. I've got people off camera, and they were busy doing something else, and I was trying to do this mad communication. In those days that you saw most of those, when you had Kerry O'Brien and co on the panel, we just did it on the panel. Much of the decision-making on executive producing was being driven by what the panel was saying. And you've now got 1, 2, 3, 4 bit. Nowadays, because I use the touch screen, I'm no longer on the panel. And I think sometimes what you get is, because I'm not with the panel, the actual commentator, Kerry and the panel used to rely on me a lot. And nowadays I'm not on the panel, so I'm not necessarily being offered that sort of a commentary to them. And they want big graphics and they want giant walls. And I think some of those things might be wound back in the future and go for something a bit simpler, and I hope so. But I think trying to imitate how the Americans do election coverage doesn't work here. We operate with live numbers, and we get primary votes, we get two candidate prefers later, we've got multiple types of numbering in our system, and we're trying to keep on top of that in some of these very complex contests. The Americans call most states on exit polls. So when the time slot goes, bang, they come on and call it. So all their graphics and productions and stuff is often pre-programmed. It's been there, it's been in the system since yesterday, the day before. Now, there's maybe half a dozen, 8 states which are in doubt, and they just take forever and ever and ever. But sometimes the big production stuff they do is all preordained. In Britain, which is just nothing like us, they go off the exit. They go off their exit poll, and it's proved to be very accurate since they changed the methodology. And they also only get one result per electorate. So their coverage is all about going to those numbers being read out on stage. We don't have that. And I remember a BBC person saying to me one day, could you imagine what your coverage would have been like if you'd crossed to where John Howard was being defeated on the night? Well, we don't have that in our system, so you just have to put up with the fact. I remember doing the 97 British election, and there was a moment when Michael Portillo lost his seat. And there was a book written after that election called "Were You Up for Portillo?" which is about the whole campaign and stuff. So, look, that's many ways these elections are done around the country. I've been blessed by the fact that I work in a country where we have a very complex system in terms of the way those figures are reported and how you analyse them. We also have a very with the Senate, I've done a lot of work with the Senate over the years, and I've been had a good record of being able to pick those early. I mean, my proudest prediction on election night was in 2004, when I said early on that Family First had won the last seat in Victoria. So I remember Nick Minchin, because there'd been a deal the Labor Party had done, and this was backfiring, and I remember Nick Minchin going, yes, and Bob McMullen going, oh. And later in the evening I said Barnaby Joyce has won the last seat in Queensland, and they just went, no. And I was right. And that's because I'd written this bit of software which took the tickets and applied them to the votes, and that was a sign of the system was really rotten, that you could pick these things early. In 2013, I remember I was saying early on that Ricky Muir, of the Australian Voting Enthusiast Party, was going to win. And we were saying that and we're publishing that, and that's what our predicted calculator was saying, because we had the tool. I'm making this indignant email from some professor of medicine saying, has the ABC taken leave of his senses? This man has 0.5% of the vote. This is a ludicrous argument. You can say that he's one that... Anyway, I just sent in the working and said, scroll down the page and explains why, and I never heard back. So, and I was right. So, I mean, and thankfully after that system they changed, and I had a lot of work to do. I did a lot of work on helping them produce the changes to the electoral system that came out of that. So I'm proud of that, and it's been wonderful that the ABC gave me a career. A 6-month contract turned into 36 years of work. So I was, as you saw there, brown hair, young looking when I started, and now I'm leaving a bit more jowly and grey-haired. So look, it's been a fantastic career, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for the honour you've given me here. I've got a few more in the next week. I think I'm being made a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, an honorary fellow, and then going to the Political Studies Association conference in a week and a half when they're making me a Lifetime Achievement Award. So there's a lot of people out there who work in academia who really respect what I've done, that I've managed to do stuff which is really good and solid and actually can sort of manage to explain this stuff. So given how academics are so bad at explaining this, maybe I've been that conduit that's been useful. So, look, it's been a great career. I'm not completely disappearing. I'm currently working a lot on documenting how the computer system works, how to set it up, and I will probably be involved in the next couple of elections. Certainly Victorian, I'm involved in the South Australian, I think that'll be pretty easy to call. The Victorian election at the end of next year will be a very interesting election and will tell us a lot about where Australian politics is going, potentially. New South Wales, I suspect, will be relatively easy to call. And then after that, I think the federal's the next one after that in late 27 or early 28. So it's funny that the federal election followed the last Queensland election, but there's another federal election before Queensland rolls around again. So look, it's been a wonderful career. I think I'm glad I'm stepping back and I'm finding time to do other things. I always think I've brought a bit of life and excitement to people. It's funny nowadays. I was down in Canberra the last 2 weeks. I handed over my tie to the Museum of Australian Democracy. What was embarrassing was getting to the end. I always thought I bought it in David Jones or something, and I looked at the tag on the back and it's Tarot Cash. So I don't know. I really can't remember where I bought it now. It was a nice tie. And then I went to the dismissal conference down there this week, which was interesting to see some of the people who were still around from that time and listen to the arguments back and forth. So, that was... it's nice that I get these invites because of what I do. So I'm trying to make sure that people don't think I'm just retiring and putting my feet. I'm still doing bits and pieces. I this week worked out that there was calculation errors in the Senate for the federal election. Well, actually, let me say that correctly. There was a calculation which is as defined in the Electoral Act, but has always been a doubtful mechanism for doing something or other. And I pointed this out this week, so hopefully that gets changed for the next election. You shouldn't get things which people don't understand happening because of a calculation. And I'm continuing to do work on things like preferences and how people decide preferences because they're becoming much, much more important. And we're at the stage now where often it's as important to work out who's finishing second and third as to know who's leading in the count. And that's been shown in the last couple of years as being a huge thing. I continue to watch with interest how politics is going generally. Having lost the last election, 2 elections badly, the coalition still seems to be thrashing around a bit. Perhaps between now and the election they'll make electricity prices the big issue. But then where do you get new electricity from to bring the electricity prices down? I mean, even you ignore the whole climate change thing, there's been a stalling on adding new anything but renewables to the grid for years. So for those who don't want to add more renewables, what are they going to add that's going to do anything in the next decade? Anyway, that's wandering off the topic a bit. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some Q&As if people have got questions.
Thank you, Tess. Tess sprung this on me moments ago, so thank you for that. Antony, what a terrific talk. That was just fantastic. As friends here were saying, I think everybody in the room would feel they know Antony really, really well, but he doesn't necessarily know all of us quite as well as we feel we know him. I've got a few questions that I've written down.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there'll be others. Let me ask the first question, and then I'm sure there'll be others who want to ask Antony a question. Antony, what was the most surprising election for you?
Well, the first one I ever did on camera was the 91 New South Wales election, and nobody expected Griner to lose his majority that night, and he did. So that was an interesting one. That was with our old computer systems. That was quite a gripping night. And it was interesting that night we did a broken coverage, and through the night people were turning on in ratings. So it's amazing how these stories go there. Jeff Kennett losing in 99, that was a complete shock for everybody. An academic friend of mine reminded me years later, I didn't remember doing this, but that day in the AFL, Essendon, who was the hot tip to win the premiership, were defeated by 1 point by Carlton that afternoon, in a complete upset. And apparently I turned to people and said, well, that's the last upset we're seeing tonight. And of course we did see another one that night with Kennett losing his majority. So that was and the third one I mentioned would just be Campbell Newman losing Queensland election in 2015. I must admit that was a difficult election for me because I had a shoulder reconstruction over the summer and the whole screen had to be run left-handed. And I don't think I'd slept for weeks. I mean, it was terrible. And then this avalanche of seats falling came through, and our computer system was very hard to keep up. I mean, usually when you see, this was an avalanche from, they'd gone from 9 seats to the mid-40s, the Labor Party. And when you see a swing like, you need to go and check some of these seats. Is this right? And there were so many falling, you just couldn't check them all. You just had to go on what the overall numbers was. Now, I must say that the elections got more complex since. So if it happened nowadays, you'd be wanting to check some of those things. But, there were elections there where I ran almost entirely off my own computer, and that nowadays I need other people to keep track of things because some of these seats are just getting very complex.
Okay, thanks. I'll look around the room. Any hands up? Anybody waving at me? Yeah, a gentleman over there.
Unfortunately, I arrived a little bit late, so I don't know all that you talked about, but have you been invited to address the National Press Club?
No. I did make a vague offer, but I said, if this is my last election, I'll come and do something like memories of elections or something, but they didn't ask me. Look, I mean, usually It'd have to be those light entertainment speeches, because generally, I mean, they tend to do slightly more serious discussions of policy and the like. So I don't live in Canberra, so that's probably another reason why they didn't think of it.
Okay. Yes, the lady over there.
How important do you think the vote for Teal independence was for getting Labor in with those 9 seats?
Well, I mean, the Teals were competing in seats that Labor generally wouldn't have a chance of winning. So in that sense, those seats did damage to the coalition. They didn't make Labor win. Labor won in the other seats. There were 2 seats where Tealish independents almost beat Labor this time, which is Bean and Fremantle. But most seats, the damage that the so-called Teals have done is to the coalition, and they're not really. It reflects. And we've seen the vote for both major parties go down substantially in the last 20 years, particularly since 2010. You know where the Labor vote's gone, most of it has gone to the Greens. You can see that if you add the two together, you're still getting to the low to mid-40s. The coalition is hard to spot where their vote's gone because it's just sprayed around to a whole bunch of series of parties. One Nation has re-emerged, but a re-emergence of One Nation is more a problem for the coalition. I covered the 98 Queensland election, which was the most extraordinary result I've ever worked on, and they just eviscerated the National Party in the bush. So if you're seeing One Nation getting 10 to 15% in national polls now, they're getting 25 to 35 in country seats. So if you wonder why the National Party's going so strong on some stuff at the moment, that's why. They're protecting their own back. And the more they have to protect their own back, the harder it becomes for them to win an election. But, you know, you've got to... After the 98 Queensland election, I always like to remind people, One Nation just eviscerated the National Party, and they'd done a preference deal with One Nation in that campaign to try and save their bacon in terms of, and to stop Labor winning. Labor fell 1 seat short of majority because of that preference deal, and they lost 6 seats, about half a dozen seats because of One Nation winning seats on national and Liberal preferences. But immediately after that election, the federal government said, we'll direct preferences against One Nation. They came to an agreement with Brian Harradine over the final 4 points of the 10-point WIC plan, which had been held up in the Senate. They just got that off the agenda. They said there was no deal, and then they went on to tax, and One Nation just shriveled in the face of that. They had nothing to say on that subject. So sometimes when you're running on the issues which actually feeds One Nation, it's actually not always to your advantage because you just feed that party on the fringe. So it'll be interesting to see in the run-up to the next election what happens. But I do tend to think that if One Nation is an issue in the election campaign, it's more a problem for the coalition because they can always trump you on something. If you come out and say we're going to lower immigration, if the coalition comes out and says, for instance, just as an example, we're going to lower immigration to 140,000 a year, it allows One Nation to come out and say, well, we're just going to stop immigration for 5 years while we figure out what it should be. You can always get trumped, but trumped, it's great that word's come up, hasn't it? It's an old word, it was here before him. That happened. I remember Rob Borbidge, the Queensland Premier in 98, he was backing the 10-point WIC plan. In one of the days of the final week of the election campaign, he flew to Century Zinc in the northwestern Australia to explain why concern over native title was causing difficulties for the mining industry and why the 10-point WIC plan needed to pass. Perfectly sensible thing to do. By the time he flew back to Brisbane, Pauline Hanson had come out and says, I don't care about the 10-point WIC plan, I'm going to abolish native title, which is a ridiculous policy. But that's the difficulty you always get with a party like that on the fringes, is that they can do that. I think couple of advantages we have in this country compared to other countries, we have compulsory voting, so it's harder for a populist cause to really break through. Unlike the Americans with the way Trump has taken over the Republican Party, every other country in the world has real political parties, and you can't take over a political party like that. So you don't get somebody come through and take hold of one of the major parties because they control their membership. That 25 years ago we managed to get control of the boat people arriving, and the Labor Party now backs that as well. So that issue, which has driven politics in Canada, in America, is driving politics in the United States, isn't occurring here in the same way. It's about more general issues to do with immigration, and it's much harder to particularise it and demonise, people coming off a boat or something in the same way. So I think that that's compulsory voting, preferential voting, and the fact that there's the politics on the right has had difficulty coalescing around one group. And often you get somebody who comes up who's even madder than the last lot. And that makes it very hard. And John Howard in 1998 did divorce himself from One Nation and did manage to separate them on stuff. But it's much harder to do now when your primary vote is so much lower. When John Howard was still one of the lowest primary votes in a long time, high 30s, they're lucky to reach 30 nowadays, and that makes it much harder. Our politics is getting more difficult because of the decline of the major party vote. One or other of the major parties will continue to form government. The Senate continues to be an interesting case. Governments do have mandates. Does that mean that you can get... it certainly was a problem in the first term of the Albanese government that he couldn't get stuff through the Senate. And the Greens, very late in the term, started to let some stuff through. So it's... I always compare, many years ago, they used to compare Australia and New Zealand in the 80s. Both countries radically reorganised the way their economies work with dropping tariffs, privatising, opening up markets. New Zealand did it all with a big bang very quickly, and some of their privatisation didn't work out very well. For instance, they sold Telstra, their telecom, all at once, and ended up with this terrible problem. They couldn't let a decade later, they couldn't let anybody else in without paying compensation to this company all the time. Most of our privatisations and deregulations occurred much slower because of the structure of our Senate and our states. And so you look at the way the two countries performed in that era. In New Zealand, their political party system fractured in the 1990s because of the pace of change. The pace of change was slower here, and we didn't get the same fracturing of parties in the same way.
Can I just follow up on you sort of mentioned that these are challenging times for the coalition and for the Liberal Party. There are some commentators predicting the demise of the Liberal Party. How do you see the Liberal Party travelling at the moment, and do you think it's in real trouble?
If you look at, historically, look at over time, you tend to see two types of parties which dominate: those that campaign to retain the status quo and slow change, and the other one wanting more radical wanting change. The coalition in Australia has always been the party of the status quo, but on the right of politics, the status quo is being challenged by more populist policies, particularly coming out of America. So, and there is, in conservative politics, a real split between populism and traditional conservatism, and that's the problem the Liberal Party are having, I think, at the moment. The Nationals are prepared to ditch true conservatism and be populist because they're not under threat. I mean, National Party seats are not falling to Labor. It's the city seats that fall, and that's where the Liberal Party holds its seats. Of course, I mean, all this, if we have a recession in 2 years' time, this view that the Labor Party is the dominant party and will win, that may be out the window. They have to handle the economy, they have to avoid interest rates going up. Electricity prices are an issue. You do have... immigration is probably an issue, but then what happens, if the government thinks it needs to deal with immigration, it just sort of ratchets down the numbers, and then the other side has to come up with a more radical policy on immigration if the government's winding them back. So I mean that's always the issue that comes up in these things. Sometimes a government heads off an issue which the opposition could use, and in the current climate, one of the difficulties I think they suffer on the coalition side is they have to move to the more radical right, where they are putting those positions out. And the Liberals and Nationals have got a problem that the Nationals really feel they have to go in this direction to maintain their position in the country, and the Liberals are getting caught in between. They need to win urban seats. So how do you win urban seats? That was a terrible result for them in the federal election.
Okay. Corinne.
Thank you. What do you feel about lowering the voting age, and do you think it will make much difference at this stage?
Well, there's not many countries have gone to 16. I'm 65. I wouldn't lower it, but I mean, I can think of some 21, 22-year-olds I wish didn't vote. But I'm not. The Greens are keen on it. Well, you can understand why. It's their support. It's the younger voters are more likely to vote for the Greens than anybody else. If it was brought in, I can't see them doing it with compulsory voting. If you've got kids who are still living at home, voluntary. The view is if it's under 16, under 18, you might make it voluntary to vote. But then it opens the whole question of, well, why do we make it voluntary? Why don't you just make it voluntary overall? So I don't feel strongly about lowering the voting age. We did it when we lowered it from 21 to 18. That was simply because we were sending people off to fight wars under the age of 21, and that's why it was lowered. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap up because Tess has suggested that, but I just want to come back to one question for you, and that was the Julia Gillard question, who asked, at the next federal election, will you be watching the ABC or will you be out having dinner with your friends?
I suspect I'll be working in the background on it. I mean, the aim has been to go off camera and not do that, and I'll do some work. I worked on the Tasmanian election without being on camera. Yeah. I will do that for the next couple of elections, maybe one more federal election. Whether I appear on camera or not, well, there'll be sort of umming and ahhing about that. But I certainly won't be taking the role that I used to do, and I'm certainly not intending to be doing websites in the future. Yeah. It's just too time consuming, but I will have some issue in some things.
Is Casey Briggs ready?
We'll see.